on the panel room. Hi, Ray.
Hi, Tony.
Yeah. So we'll give it a couple more minutes, and then I think we'll start introducing. Oh, yeah. Okay, let's get starting. Hi everyone, welcome back to our Applied ARL seminar series. I'm Tony Chin from DDAI Labs. I'm the host for today's talk. We are super excited to have Professor Keith Ross and two of his students, Watcher and Yiming, with us today in the panel room. Professor Keith Ross has been the Dean of Engineering and Computer Science at NYU Shanghai since 2013. Previously, he was a professor at NYU Tandon Poly for 10 years, University of Pennsylvania for 13 years, and Eurocon Institute in France for 5 years. He received a PhD in computer and control engineering from the University of Michigan. He is an ACM fellow and an IEEE fellow. His current research interests are in deep and tabular reinforcement learning. He has also worked in internet privacy, peer-to-peer networking, internet measurement, stochastic modeling of computer networks, queuing theory, and Markov decision processes. He is the co-author of the most popular textbook on computer networking. At NYU Shanghai, he has been teaching machine learning, reinforcement learning, and introduction to computer programming. Today, Professor Ross is going to talk about recent advances in sample-efficient deep ARL. So without further ado, I'll hand over the virtual microphone to Professor Ross.
Thank you so much, Tony. I guess I can, I go into screen share here now, yeah. And I'll do that. And so we can all see the screen. And we have here, okay. So just confirm, Tony, everything good here? You can see my screen, right?
Yes, it's very clear.
Okay. So hello, everyone. It's I'm here in Shanghai right now, and it's 9 a.m. in Shanghai. And I know many of you are all over the world. Some people in Asia, some people in California, some people on the East Coast. And it's very nice to speak with you this morning. I'm joined with two of my PhD students, Yiming Zhang and Chuo Wang. They will be participating in questions and answers and discussion at the end of the talk. So why don't we get into it? What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about some recent activities in our lab here at NYU Shanghai, our DRL lab at NYU Shanghai. The lab currently consists of this team here. It's myself and 3 PhD students and some NYU Shanghai undergraduates, current and recently graduated NYU Shanghai undergraduates. I'm just going to go around real quick, introduce these people. We have on the left here is Yiming Zhang, and then there's myself, and in the back is Zhong Wang, who just recently graduated from NYU Shanghai as an undergrad. Way in the back is a PhD student, Yanqiu Wu, also known as Autumn Wu. And next to her is Xinyue Chen. She's a junior at NYU Shanghai, and she's been actively working with us since her freshman year at NYU Shanghai. In front of her is Chuo Wang. He's a PhD student at NYU. And also in front of him is Zijie Zhou, who was formerly an undergraduate at NYU Shanghai and is going to graduate school next year. So just very briefly, a few words about me. Tony provided that very nice introduction. I just want to mention that I haven't been working actually in reinforcement learning all my life. I spent most of my career actually working in computer networking, in particular in mathematical modeling and measurement of computer networks, and also quite a bit of time working in peer-to-peer networks when that was very hot. And I used to actually do a lot of measurement studies of the Chinese network, PP Live, you may recall that. And with my co-author, Jim Cross, we have this textbook on computer networking, and we're very proud of that. We just released the 8th edition of that book. Then around 2010, before getting into computer networking, actually, I worked in quite a bit in Markov decision processes when I was a PhD student, and then when in my first 10 years at University of Pennsylvania. So in those days, I used to work in Markov decision processes and constrained Markov decision processes and their application to queuing networks. And then I left that field, and I'm going to explain why in a few minutes, and entered computer networking. And then I worked in internet privacy. And then most recently with this group and my PhD students and those undergraduate students, we've been working in deep reinforcement learning. So, I think we all know this. DRL is a very exciting field. And I personally feel the most exciting thing about it is that it breaks through the curse of dimensionality. I think it was Bellman who originally coined this term, the curse of dimensionality. And what that means basically is that as the state space, if the state space is multidimensional, as soon as the dimension grows a little bit, the state space gets too big, and a traditional MDP algorithms and dynamic programming algorithms a breakdown because they cannot handle very large, computationally, they cannot handle very large state spaces. And so, and this I found also when I was working in Markov decision processes in the late 80s and early 90s, I also found this very frustrating. I found it very, all these kind of problems that we wanted to solve, like in computing networks, we couldn't solve them because of the curse of dimensionality. There was just this barrier there. And I think what, really the biggest breakthrough that we've had here is that, by introducing neural networks, introducing the deep into Markov decision processes and reinforcement learning, we have been able to break through this curse of dimensionality and can now solve problems that have astronomical numbers of states. So very high dimensional problems, both in the state space and the action space. And that's what I find to be very, very exciting. Other thing is that I think, as we all know, is that AI is very, very hot topic around the world now. And DRL is really at the core of AI. It's not a peripheral topic of AI. It's really a mainstream AI topic. And that makes it also very exciting. So before talk about the specifics of some of our recent research, let's just talk about what makes a good DRL training algorithm. What makes a DRL, deep reinforcement learning training algorithm good? So probably the most important measure is asymptotic performance. And asymptotic performance basically is, how close do we get to the performance of the optimal policy? Does our training algorithm bring us near to the performance of the optimal policy? That's perhaps the most important measure. But a second very, very important measure, maybe almost as important as the first measure, is sample efficiency. Is how many environment interactions are needed to get to that very high performance. So for example, if we're training a robot, how many times does the robot have to interact? We have to interact with the robot in order to get to train it to get very high performance. If we have to interact with it millions of times, then we're probably going to wear the robot out before we're ever going to be able to find that good policy. So sample efficiency is very important. Another important feature of an algorithm, we argue, is simplicity and elegance. If your algorithm is very complicated, it most likely will not extend across many different environments and many different settings. And it also will be very difficult to really understand what's making the algorithm do well. If the algorithm has all these bells and whistles, it becomes so complicated, you really don't know what's going on anymore. So we always strive to obtain the simplest possible algorithm that we can while achieving high performance and high sample efficiency. Other important measures are robustness across environments. You would like your training algorithms to do well in many different types of environments. And of course, computational efficiency. We would like to be able to run these algorithms relatively quickly. So just some quick review. As probably many of you know, there are really two classes, broad classes of DRL problems. One class is the online problems, and the other class is the batch reinforcement problems. Our group has done work both in online and in batch RL, but today I'm going to mostly talk about online RL. And in online RL, there are two classes of algorithms. One is first of all, in online RL, the basic structure is that we alternate between data collection and parameter updates. So what we typically do is we have a current policy, and with that current policy, we collect data, and then we use the data that we've collected to update our parameters for our Q functions, update our parameters for our policy, and so forth. And so in the online setting, there are two general classes of algorithms. There's the on-policy algorithms and the off-policy algorithms. And on-policy algorithms, the basic thing going on there is that we use data collected from our current policy to do the parameter updates. So when we do parameter updates, we only use data from our current policy. And in the off policy case, we use data not only from our current policy, but also data that was generated by previous policies. And that data is put in a replay buffer, and we use data from that replay buffer to perform parameter updates. So anyway, that's just a little bit of a high-level introduction to DRL algorithms. And I'll mention that in our group, all of the research that we've done pretty much has been when we benchmark our algorithms, we use the Majoko environments, and we like the Majoko environments because they're in the public domain. They're very challenging. They have very high dimensional state spaces and high dimensional action spaces. They have continuous state spaces and continuous action spaces. So they make for some very challenging, interesting environments. And in particular, the ant and humanoid environments are two of the more challenging Majoko environments. And we often focus on those two. So just before we get into the details of research, I just want to show you, mention that our group has recently published a number of papers in deep reinforcement learning in the conferences ICLR, ICML, and NeurIPS. And and again, some of these papers are on policy, deep reinforcement learning, some are on off policy, some are on batch DRL, and most of them are on online DRL. And today I'm just going to present these two papers listed at the top here. So why don't we get into it now? I'm going to discuss two of these papers. The first paper is called Randomized Ensemble Double Q Learning, Learning Fast Without a Model. And this is co-authored with Xinyue Chen, Chiu Wang, and Zijian Zhou. And those three authors are all equal contributors to this particular work. And it was this paper is going to appear in ICLR 2021. Just once again, Chiu Wang is a PhD student at NYU, and he'll be joining us at the end of the talk. And Xinyue and Zijian are two undergraduates at NYU Shanghai. So this particular slide isn't actually a slide from our paper. This slide here, this figure here, comes from the Berkeley DRL group. And in particular, it comes from their soft actor critic paper, their second paper on soft actor critic, the one that uses the adaptive parameter. And what this figure is showing is it's comparing their new this is a 2018 algorithm, and it's comparing soft actor critic with a number of other algorithms. And soft actor critic right now is one of the state-of-the-art algorithms for the Majoko environments, and it's an off-policy algorithm. And in this particular figure, it's the blue line, and we can see that the blue line is doing, and this is the training curve, and it's doing extremely well in all the environments. Compared, for example, with PPO, which is the brown line at the bottom, and TD3, which is the green line, and TD3 does very poorly, for example, for humanoid, but soft actor critics does quite well in all these environments. So the question is it possible to come up with so again, soft actor critic is off policy algorithm, and it's also a model free algorithm. And so question is it possible to come up with a model-free algorithm that does better than SAC, and in particular does much better than SAC? Is it possible to do that? And the answer indeed is yes. So we, in this ICLR paper that is just about to be published, we have a new algorithm which we refer to as REDQ, which stands for Randomized Ensembled Double Q Learning. And this figure here shows the results for 4 environments, 4 of the more challenging environments. And again, if we look at and that one major difference here is that if we go back to the SAC diagram here, the number of training steps shown here is ranges from 1 million to 10 million. So for example, for humanoid, they're showing 10 million training steps. And for example, for walker, they're showing 3 million training steps. In this figure here, we're showing what happens at the very early stages of training. So here we're showing what happens really in the first 300,000 training steps. So we're not talking about 3 million or 10 million training steps. We're talking about what happens in the first 300,000 training steps, 300,000 environment interactions. And the light blue line here, the light blue line is SAC. So SAC, which previously gives state-of-the-art performance, we can see is doing, does not do as well as anywhere as well as the RegQ algorithm. So the RegQ algorithm, which is also a model-free algorithm, I'm going to describe it in a second, learns much, much faster than SAC. So for example, in humanoid, after, within 300,000 environment interactions, it gets up to close to 5,000 in performance, where in SAC, we see here that in SAC to get to 5,000 performance, you need about 3 million environment interactions. So it's about 10 times faster than SAC in many ways. And the dark blue line is another algorithm. It's not our algorithm. It's also an algorithm from the Berkeley group called MBPO, and that came out about 2 years ago. And that algorithm is a model-based algorithm. That stands for model-based policy optimization. And that is a model-based algorithm. And that's pretty much the state-of-the-art of model-based algorithms for the MuJoCo environments, at least for early stage training. And what we see here also, another thing that we learned from this figure is that the model-free algorithms can do just as well as the best model-based algorithms, if not better. So this puts into question the need to study model-based algorithms. So what are the key ingredients behind this new algorithm, RegQ? One important ingredient is it uses an update to data ratio that's greater than 1. So what's the update to data ratio? It's the number of updates compared to the number of environment interactions. So SAC and most of the off-policy algorithms, including TD3, DDPG, etc., they all use an update to data ratio of 1. That is, for every one interaction with the environment, they do one update of their parameters. And the problem is, it's a natural thing to consider increasing that update to data ratio. But when you do that, those algorithms tend to break down. And we're going to talk about why that happens in a few seconds. RegQ does use a very high update to data ratio. It turns out that even a UTD value, a small UDT value, say of 3, can do pretty well. But in our experiments, we've been typically running at 15 and 20. And I picked that graph, that figure I just showed you, using UT value of 15. But the thing is that the issue that we're going to see is that when you have a high UTD ratio, you can have a bias problem. And so to control the bias, what we do in RegQ is we introduce ensembles. But we introduce ensembles in a very special way. We combine ensembles with double Q learning in a very special way that enables us to control the bias and the standard deviation of the bias. So here is the algorithm, and we'll just walk through it very quickly here. This is the RegQ algorithm and the pseudocode. And if at first glance, it looks a lot like SAC. It looks like SAC. It has entropy maximization in it, as you see over here. These terms over here for the target for the Q function and the target for the policy update. So it has entropy maximization. Like SAC, there's a phase where we collect data, put the data in a replay buffer, and then there's a phase where we update the parameters, and then we collect more data. But it has three very important differences from SAC, and those differences are highlighted in red. There's the G, the N, and the M also here in red. So one important difference is the G here. The G is our update to data ratio, and we use a value typically on the order of about 15 or 20. And so basically what we're doing is for every interaction with the environment, we're going to update G times. We're not going to update once, like in the traditional algorithms. We're going to update G times. But in order to do that, we're going to need to control bias and standard deviation of bias. And we're going to do that by introducing ensembles. So again, most of the standard off-policy algorithms use 2Q functions, and they use that for double Q learning. But we're going to use NQ functions, and a typical N value for us might be 10 ensemble members. And so we're going to use NQ functions, and so we're going to use that in our ensembling. And you can see here when we do our update, we're going to take the average of when we do our policy update, we're going to take the average of the 10Q functions. But what's most important here is how we define the target. So when we update the Q functions, we have these, say, NQ functions. We're going to use the same target for each of the Q functions. Each Q function is initialized differently. That's what makes them different. But we're going to then use the same target. But in the target here, what we do is normally what's done in SAC and TD3 is you minimize between two Q functions, right? We minimize between two Q, we only have two Q functions, and we minimize those two Q functions. Here we have capital N Q functions, and what we do is we randomly choose capital M of those. So M is another parameter, so how many Q functions we choose, and we randomly choose capital M Q functions, and then take the minimum across those capital M Q functions in the target here. And so this is sort of the secret sauce of getting RegQ to work properly. And so we've done a lot of ablations with the values of M here, and we find, though, however, that the best M, both theoretically and through ablations, is capital M equaling to 2. So in the graph, in the figures I showed you earlier, we use the capital M equal to 2. So here we actually minimize over 2 Q functions. That's what we call it double Q learning. But the 2 Q functions that we're using is a random choice of 2 Q functions, 2 from capital, say, 10 Q functions. So that's the algorithm. It's a very simple algorithm, and that's what's giving us the results that we showed earlier. Now, just provide a little bit of explanation about why RegQ does so well. What we're here is these figures here are all for the environment ant. And what we're comparing here is 3 algorithms: RegQ, SAC, but with a UDT ratio of 20, and also just naive ensembling with 20, also with a UDT ratio of 20. And so the first, there's 3 curves here. Let's look at the first one. The first one is the performance of ANT. And what it's showing here is that, once again, RegQ does better than SAC with a UDT, a very high UDT value. In fact, SAC of a UDT value of 1 does better than SAC of a UDT value of 20. And SAC does also much better than just naive ensembling. And the second plot here is quite interesting. Is we're plotting here the average bias. And by average, we mean averaged over various state action pairs. So various state action pairs, And what we see here is that for RegQ, the bias here, we tend to underestimate. The zero line is here. You can't see it very clearly, but it's here. So SAC tends to underestimate a little bit the bias, but the average bias is almost constant. It's remarkably constant throughout training. It's just fixed value, just almost a fixed value. Whereas the average bias for SAC 20 starts off to be very, very high, does get down, but fluctuates a lot and has a lot of variation. Similarly, the average bias for naive ensembling starts off very, very high, comes down, and then flattens out. Then perhaps the most interesting curve on this page is this third curve, which shows the standard deviation of the bias. And here, by standard deviation, we mean the variance of the bias across different states and actions at any given training point. So how much does the variance vary? How much does the bias vary between different states and actions? Now, bias, again, I should have perhaps said this at the beginning. What is the bias? Just to make sure that it's clear what we're talking about. The bias is the difference between what the Q value says, the return should be, and what the actual return is. So the bias is sort of the error, and it's not the absolute value of the error, it's just the difference. So that's why it can be positive or negative. And so here we're looking at the standard deviation of the bias. So we're basically looking at the standard deviation of the error here across the standard deviation across different state action values. And again, we see that RegQ has a very low standard deviation. It comes down very quickly and then has a very, very low standard deviation. Whereas SAC20 has this huge standard deviation, which means that in SAC20, the bias for one state action pair can be very, very different from the bias for another state action pair. So what we're seeing, so the main point that the slide is trying to get across is that by using ensembles and carefully using the ensembles with combining it with double Q learning, we can control the bias and increase the UDT value pretty much as high as we want it to be, and still have low bias and low standard deviation of the bias. Excuse me. So also in the paper, just for those who may want to glance at it, we have a mathematical theory for tabular RegQ. We have extensive ablations, all using the same code base. We also combined RegQ with online feature extractor and showed that we can learn even faster for humanoid. And finally, I want to mention that Chu Wang maintains a source code on his GitHub page. It's very, very easy to use source code, very user-friendly, very, very clean. And there's also, he provides a video tutorial there. So conclusion for the RegQ paper is that it's a model-free method with very high sample efficiency. It seems to indicate that model-free DRL can do as well, if not better, than model-based DRL. With extensive experiments and with a mathematical theory, we explain why RegQ works so well. And we combine RegQ with OFE to show that RegQ OFE can learn extremely fast for a humanoid. So now I'm very briefly going to talk about the second paper and then open things up for discussion. And in the second paper, it appeared in NeurIPS 2020 as a spotlight presentation. The co-authors are Yiming Zhang, a PhD student at NYU. Quan Vogue, who is formerly an undergraduate at NYU Shanghai, is now a PhD student at UC San Diego, and myself here. And so just as quick motivation, as we all know, the standard sort of discounted reinforcement learning problem is to minimize the expected discounted reward. But many real-world applications have certain safety constraints. For example, self-driving cars. Like we might want to find the best policy, but at the same time, limit the average speeds to be less than, say, 70 miles per hour or 100 kilometers per hour, for example. And so the question is how do we account for safety constraints in reinforcement learning? So that leads us to constrained Markov decision problems. And the constrained Markov decision problem can be posed in this way. We have two objectives, essentially. We have a reward function and we have a cost function. And as always, we want to maximize the expected long-term discounted reward, but we have a constraint that we want the long-term discounted, expected long-term discounted cost to be less than a given value. And here that given value is denoted by B. So it's a constrained optimization problem. And constrained MDPs have been around for a long time. Actually, my own PhD thesis is called, which was written in 1985, is called Constrained Markov Decision Processes with Queuing Applications. But more recently, there's been renewed interest in constrained MDPs, not from our group so much, but from other groups in the DRL context. And in particular, before reviewing that work, let me just state the problem more clearly. We want to consider, in the DRL context, we want to consider policies in some parameterized policy class, for example, a neural network with a fixed architecture. And as we update the policy, as we train the policy, we want to guarantee constraint satisfaction throughout training. And in this particular research, we're going to focus on on-policy algorithms. So work in off-policy is still very open, and there's still probably a lot of opportunity to do interesting work there. So given a constraint satisfying policy at the current iteration, our goal is to generate an improved constraint satisfying policy. So I'm just going to review some previous work that's been done in this area. There's Joshua Akium and his colleagues in 2017 published a paper in ICML called Constrained Policy Optimization. And the approach that they took is very much motivated by the so-called trust region approaches that are very common in on-policy DRL. And many of you out there are probably familiar with the trust region approach. It's the basis for algorithms such as TRPO, and it also has been a motivational factor for PPO. So the trust region problem looks like the one shown, the standard one, looks like the one shown on this slide, but without this constraint in the middle here. So the standard trust region problem is to maximize the expected value of the advantage function evaluated at the current policy theta k, subject to this constraint here. Now, this constraint at the bottom, what it's basically saying is that, so basically what the way that this is derived is that they make some approximations. The goal is to be able to update your policy using samples from your current policy. And to do that, they need to make some approximations. And those approximations are valid. They're reasonably good if the policies that you're optimizing over, that's pi theta, the new policies, are close to your current policy that's generating the data. So to make sure it's close, what we require is the expected KL divergence of the new policy to be within delta of the old policy. So this again is kind of standard stuff for the trust region approach, and again it forms the basis of the TRPO algorithm. And in this paper, the CPO paper, what they did is they extended that approach to handle a constraint. And it turns out that when you have a constraint, then and you follow the sort of same logic in the theory, you end up adding an additional constraint that looks like this here. And so in their approach, this sort of trust region approach, they evaluate the constraint value of the current policy using samples collected from the old policy. So that's what we want to do. We want to evaluate as we look at new possible policies, we want to evaluate the constraint. We want to make sure the constraint is not exceeding that value B. And in order to evaluate that constraint, what we're going to do is use samples from our current policy theta k. And they show in their paper that the solution has an approximate worst case constraint violation guarantee. So it's a very nice theoretical result. And then to solve this problem, the approach that's taken is the same approach that TRPO takes, is they use a Taylor series approximation, which is a second order approximation to solve the problem. And that approximation introduces additional errors, and that's something that we would like to avoid in our research. So, so our algorithm, first order constrained optimization policy search, uses a two-step approach. The first is first approach is what we're going to do is we're going to solve this optimization problem not in the parameterized space, but actually in the original MDP space. So I'm going to show you that in a second. And so the first step is to actually try to solve the problem. Yeah. Try to solve the problem in the well, excuse me, I think I need to mute their microphone. Thank you. What we need to do, we're going to do is solve the problem in the original MDP space, and then we're going to project that solution to the neural network space. And this sort of approach, we introduced this approach actually a little bit earlier in 2019 in an ICLR paper where we did something similar to this, but we've taken it several steps further in this paper. And in the original paper, we didn't use constraints. So, so basically, first step, as I mentioned, is that we're going to try to solve that optimization problem, which again, the purpose of this optimization problem is to move us from policy pi theta k to policy pi theta k plus 1. And we're going to solve this optimization problem not using Taylor series approximations, but instead we're going to solve it directly in the MDP space. And it turns out that that optimization problem, we have a theorem in our paper, has this very nice closed form solution. It says that if we want to, again, the optimal policy, so the optimal pi that solves this this optimization problem is given of this form here. And so you see it depends, of course, on the previous policy, the pi theta k. It depends on the advantage function of the previous policy. It depends on the advantage function of the cost function for the previous policy. And it also depends on two Lagrange multipliers, lambda and nu. We have two constraints, so as you can expect, we have two Lagrange multipliers. And the optimal Lagrange multipliers can be found by solving this optimization problem that's given at the bottom of this page here. So we have this optimization problem. And so we have this nearly closed form solution for what the optimal policy looks like. So that's the first step, is we get this closed form solution. And then the second step is now we can't use this policy in practice. It still has a normalization constant in it. So we still need to project this. We still need to find a policy that's in our neural network. And so what we do then is we project this policy onto the neural network. That is, we try to find the neural network parameters that give us a policy that's close as possible to the optimal policy pi star. And to do that, what we're going to do is find the theta parameter in our neural network that minimizes the expected KL divergence between pi theta and pi star. And so it turns out that, and then to minimize this, we're going to take, we're going to use gradient steps. So we're going to need to get the gradient of this loss function. And so we have a theorem in our paper that gives us a very computationally efficient way of calculating the gradient of this loss function. And then once again, to calculate that gradient, to estimate that gradient, we only need to take samples from our current policy, theta k. So that's basically the approach. And so this is the algorithm here. And just quickly going through the algorithm, we have a value network for the reward function. We have a value network for the cost function. What we do is, as standard in all policy cases, we're going to generate trajectories from the current policy. We're going to use those trajectories to estimate Monte Carlo returns from those trajectories to estimate the cost, the discounted cost return, the advantage functions. We're going to update the Lagrangian parameter nu according to this formula here. Basically, the idea is that we're trying to get the cost function to approach the constraint, to get it to be binding. So we're going to be slowly modifying nu so that this happens. And then after that, we're going to go through, we have this data that we've collected from our current policy. We're going to go through that data capital K times using mini batches. And the way we do that is to take gradient steps using that KL divergence that I just mentioned, where again, it's the KL divergence between the current policy, the policy that we're optimizing and pi. So this is the policy from the neural network, and this is the optimal policy that has that structure. And so we have a formula for calculating this, estimating this gradient. And then just like always is always done in trust region, for trust region approaches, we keep on doing this until the policy gets far away from theta k. So when the policy that we're optimizing gets to be too far away from the policy from which we're collecting samples, then we stop the algorithm. And then that's when we have our policy pi theta k and repeat the procedure with this new policy. So this slide here actually has some experimental results. We show here for 3 environments. There are more environments. All six environments are shown in the paper. But what we're plotting here is we have 3 environments: ant, hopper, and humanoid. And we have these 2 rows. The bottom row is the cost, the long-term cost, and the top row is the long-term discounted reward. And what we're seeing, and we're comparing here several different algorithms. Our algorithm is the blue one, FOCUPS. The other algorithm that we mentioned earlier, CPO, is the orange algorithm. And then the green and the red are 2 very natural algorithms. One is like a constrained version of PPO, and another one is a constrained version of TRPO. And this dotted line here is the cost. And basically the cost here is we're trying to maximize performance while keeping the speed, the velocity of our robot below a certain threshold. And what we're seeing here is that, for example, our algorithm, which is FOCUPS, always keeps the cost very close, below the threshold or very, very close to the threshold, basically hugs the threshold. So we're really not violating the cost criterion during training. Throughout training, we're essentially below the threshold. Whereas some other algorithms, for example, TRP Lagrangian, sometimes exceeds the threshold. And then given that we're meeting the cost, we now look at the reward, and we see that FOCUPS is actually doing better than all the other schemes, including CPO. So it gives a significantly higher reward, sometimes 50%, 70% higher than the other schemes. So so that's just sort of the results for that case. So in summary, we have a 2-step approach to solving the constrained MDP problem with approximate constraint satisfaction guarantees. And it only involves first-order methods. It does not involve second-order methods like Taylor series approximations. And it's very, very easy to implement. and achieves better performance compared to a set of standard baselines. So I want to thank everyone out there for listening in, and I very much enjoyed giving this presentation. And we discussed two papers. First paper was on red Q, and the second paper was on full cups. And now I'd like to introduce again two of my PhD students. And since I've been talking so much and I'm kind of exhausted, I'm gonna sip some water. I'm gonna let Cho Wang and Yiming Zhang handle most of the questions here. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to them. I don't know if I need to do anything. I guess I'll stop screen share here, and I'll hand it over to them.
Thank you, Professor Ross. Yeah, so for audience on Zoom, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A area, and so that we are able to see them. So there was one question regarding how to find the optimal N and G. I think that this is for the sample efficiency paper, and I see that Che has already given an explanation for that.
Maybe Che can sort of reread the question and explain his response. So you'll need to unmute. Okay.
Yeah, sure. So we just got a question from the audience that any way to find the optimal N and G. So recall that N is the number of ensemble networks for the Q networks, and then G is the update to data ratio. That's how many network updates you take compared to the total number of environment data that you collected. So, and my response is that to achieve a better sample efficiency, that we might want to use a relatively large number of updates. So compared to your data, so we want to use a higher G, as especially in the early stage of training, when it's possible to learn very fast. And then when you're using a large G, a large update to data ratio, then it's possible that your Q bias accumulation will be faster. So to deal with that, typically you can use any method that can reduce your bias. So in our case, we use this randomized ensemble. So you might want to increase the number of ensembles if you're finding that you're having a large bias issue. So how do you detect such an issue? So in our paper, the way we do it is we try to estimate the Q bias by computing this Monte Carlo return. So basically, you can when you have your policy and your Q networks, you can let agent run in the environment, and then that will give you some Monte Carlo return, and then you can use that as an unbiased estimate of the true Q value. And you can compare that true Q value compared to your true Q value compared to your current Q estimate, and then you will find you will get an estimated value of your Q bias. So if your Q bias is too high, then you might want to increase the ensemble size, or you might want to like decrease your update to data ratio. Yeah, and then in addition to that, you also have the common methodology of hyperparameter tuning. Yeah, so that's the answer.
I actually regarding the same paper, I have a more basic question. So what is the fundamental reason for a higher bias, basically a result from the higher UTG, UTD, I think.
Yeah. So the question is, what contributes to this kind of bias accumulation? Yeah. Right. So essentially, if we look back to the original DQN paper. We can see that from DQN, the deep Q learning paper, to the more recent double Q learning paper. So we see this. We will, so basically, if you look at the paper, you see an early investigation of how essentially the maximization operation in the Q learning can lead to typically a positive bias accumulation. So basically, what happens is when you do Q learning, you have this when you do essentially the Bellman update, you have this operation where you will take a maximum over the Q values of the next state over all the possible actions. So this kind of maximization typically leads to a high probability of having positive bias accumulation. So what we observe is that in the continuous action space, so the Mojoko environments, so we typically observe a more severe problem of bias accumulation, and this can also be seen from the offline learning papers. So if you look at some of the recent research on training entirely offline data, so that means you collect some, you have some data set, and then you just directly train from those data sets without further interacting with the environment. So you cannot further collect more data. So in that case, we actually have this very problematic bias accumulation, and then that's so part of that is like a distribution mismatch, because when you're using a low UTD and when you're not training in an offline setting, typically what happens is if your policy is making a mistake, you can further interact with the environment, and you can collect some new data points, and that is going to fix the mistakes in a high level sense. So right.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's basically, it's kind of like what happened, but we have a more elaborate argument in our paper, and you may want to check the paper for more details.
Sure. And in the algorithm statement in one of the slides, it seems to me that the target network parameter are updated with the same frequency as the network itself. That seems to be different from the common practice that you would do, for example, in the DQN, where the target network will be updated in a much lower frequency. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so for that, it's actually the same as the SAC paper. So in SAC, they actually have this target Q network, and it's basically like a exponentially moving average of your Q network. So basically, you have basically after each Q update, you kind of update your target network to move a bit closer to your current Q network, and we're keeping that part the same as what's done in the SAC paper. In some other papers, it's done in a different way. So for example, in the TD Street paper, what they're doing is they actually, in their paper, they actually try to update their target network. Actually, I think it's the policy network to with a slower frequency, and they call that delayed policy update. And in the SAC paper, you can also find an ablation where they actually try to update the target Q network with like a faster or slower rate. And you can treat that as kind of like a hyperparameter. But what we're doing is essentially because we're trying to achieve a fair comparison. So we're trying to keep our components as same with the previous work as possible.
Sure. So from the audience, there's another question. Can you elaborate on how to compute the KL divergence in the second paper? I assume this is in a non-parametric setting, right?
Hi. So in our paper, basically, in the second step of our paper, we minimize the loss function, which is the KL divergence between a parameterized policy pi theta and also pi star, which is a non-parametric policy. So I guess this is the KL divergence the question is referring to, but please correct me if I'm wrong. So the way we do it is that we use a gradient descent approach to minimize that KL divergence, that particular loss function. And the cool thing that we found in our paper is that when we take the gradient of that KL between the non-parametric policy and the parameterized policy, the normalization term or the partition function Z actually cancels out. So the gradient term doesn't actually involve the partition function. And all that's left, and one of the terms that's left is actually just the KL divergence between the old policy pi theta k and pi theta. And usually, as it's done in most on-policy papers, the way we parameterize the policy is just to have a neural network which inputs the states, and because we're assuming a Gaussian policy, so basically the neural network outputs the mean vector and also a covariance matrix for that Gaussian policy. And because it's a Gaussian policy, we can calculate the KL divergence explicitly if we have the mean and the covariance matrix. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I actually, yeah, that's also related to one question I have in mind, which is also about solving that basically dual problem when you are computing the optimal update policy pi star. There are two parameters in that problem, and in the actual algorithm, I think you just do a gradient step for one of the parameters, right? Is it possible, for example, to do optimize the two parameters in an alternating way or something like that?
So the problem we found was that because the dual problem involves the partition function Z, and if you have any action space that's reasonably big, then it becomes pretty much impractical to solve that dual function directly. And the thing that we found in our paper was that because the form of the optimal policy actually kind of looks like this Boltzmann distribution, right? Where the lambda term, so one of our dual parameters, actually looks a lot like the inverse temperature term or this exploration term that's usually used in maximum entropy reinforcement learning. And based on what's previously done in a lot of the other literature in this area, we found that keeping that exploration parameter fixed actually works pretty well in practice. As for the second dual parameter, nu, we found that we needed to do a gradient update in order to be able to adjust to being able to kind of hug or fit the cost of the problem at hand. And what we found in our paper was that we came up with an update term that's kind of based on the gradient update term, but it's not exactly. So what we found basically was that when the old policy and the current policy are actually very, very close, then the update term that we use for that new is actually very, very close to an actual stochastic gradient update for that particular parameter. But kind of to answer your question, if the action space is very small, meaning that we can actually calculate the Z explicitly, then yeah, it would be possible to get a more accurate estimate of the dual parameters in this case.
Okay. Actually, to follow up on the gradient descent step for solving the second parameter in that dual problem, I actually gone through the paper, and so in there it seems that you basically made some modification to the gradient itself. You said that it's because when your policy, the new policy, is far away from the current one, the gradient is more off. And so actually from the optimization point of view, like when we typically do gradient descent through a gradient descent scheme, so we can control the step size, right? Like if we think that the gradient is is not reliable, probably then you use a more conservative step size. Can you do that here, or is it a more critical to modify that gradient sampling?
We didn't. So in practice, we didn't really play around with the step size for that particular gradient update too much. But I suppose potentially, I think it is something that we could do. So the thing that we were kind of comparing was that basically the direction of the gradient, the update term that we used is very close to the direction of the actual gradient. If the old policy is very, very close to the current policy. And we used a lot of measures in our paper in order to kind of guarantee that, which is why also that trust region constraint is in place, so that every step of the update, it needs to make sure that the current policy is very, very close to the old policy. Yeah.
Any question from the panel?
So there was also just a question posted on the question and answer chat. I think it's probably which I just typed the answer, but I can just talk about it briefly. So the question is, does RECQ has a theoretical foundation is related to Thompson sampling? And then what's the difference between RECQ and other sample efficient methods, for example, curiosity driven methods? Right, so there are a number of theoretical results on the QBIS issue. There is, for example, the WTQM paper where they have a theoretical analysis and also a empirical study on how QBIS happen and how to solve it in the Atari environment. And there's some early work also on the theoretical study, mainly in the tabular case, how this bias issue come into play. And in the continuous action space problems, is the TD3 paper where they have essentially, I think that's one of the early bias study in the continuous environment, and then they also proposed the clip WQ method, which is a very useful method in continuous action space. That's also being used in the SAC paper. And then there is the maximum Q-learning paper, where they also have a kind of ensemble. They tested that in the Atari environment, and they also have some theoretical results, which we build upon in our paper. And then in terms of the relation to other exploration methods, so exploration is basically a different direction of study. So for example, the person who asked the question mentioned there's curiosity-driven methods. So for example, some of the curiosity-driven methods will have this kind of nullity score. So you can, for example, use a uncertainty measure that can be coming from like for example, I guess possibly an ensemble of networks. You can use for example, the standard deviation of an ensemble of Q networks, or you can use, for example, if you're a model-based method, you can use the disagreement between the model's predictions. You can use that to compute like a curiosity score. So basically, this number will tell the agent that whether you have not seen, for example, a state frequently. So in that setting, you can actually add this reward, this kind of fake reward, to the actual reward that agent is getting, and you can basically using that reward signal to tell the agent to explore better the state space. Yeah. So in that setting, you can also use ensemble, but it will be used in a pretty different way.
I will just add that in the RECQ paper also, we have developed a theory there where we explore these two parameters. One is the number of ensembles n, and also the m, the number of Q functions that we randomize over. And we show that we can sort of control the bias and the standard deviation of the bias separately with those two parameters. And sort of the theory sort of points to m equal to 2 being a good parameter. So just mention that that's in there.
Yeah, talking about that part. So I think in the paper, basically you laid out the way to compute the target in the tabular case for the in-target minimization. And I was wondering, does it work if we switch the min and max? Because in the current form, it seems to me that the other way around is more intuitive. Like first of all, you pick the maximal action for each Q in the ensemble, and then you take the minimum of that. Whereas in the current form, I think it's the other way around, that you basically you fix an action, and then you do the minimization.
Sure. Do you want to respond to that? I seem to recall that we discussed that, and I don't know if we did experiments along those lines. It was some time.
Let's see. So you mean switch the min and the max term? Maybe I can share my screen to
yeah.
See. Okay. So
you're talking about for the tabular case, Tony,
yes.
or for the tabular case?
For the tabular case.
Okay. So you're saying switching the max and the min here?
Yeah, in the tabular case, I think, right. Yeah, you have maximum outside and then minimum inside. So that means basically for each fixed action, you pick a minimal Q among all the components of the ensemble. Whereas I was asking, basically, if you switch it seems to be more intuitive. Like for each ensemble component, you are picking the maximal value action, and that's what the Q-learning is doing, right?
Yeah. So I'll just step in here. It's this sort of relates to old double Q learning, right? And even in the book in Sutton and Bartow for the tabular case, they discuss double Q learning, and the issue is that if without that that minimization on the inside, we have a bias problem. So the real reason for that minimization on the inside is to address this bias issue, and it's more severe in the DRL case, but even arises in the tabular case. And so, that's why we have the minimization there on the inside.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like if we switch it, it might not really work.
Yeah, because if you switch, we're no longer taking care of that double Q problem. Anyway. Okay.
Okay. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Let's see. Do we have any other question from the panel or from the general audience.
No questions from YouTube.
Okay.
So with that, then I guess I'd like to thank Tony for organizing this wonderful seminar series and all the panelists and program members. I think it's really a great idea to have this seminar series, and thank you for inviting us to present in your series. And so on behalf of Yiming and Cho, who also goes by the name of Watcher, we'd like to thank everyone for attending, and we hope to see you in person, hopefully in 2022 at the whatever conferences there are in 2022. We hope to see you there.
Yeah, very optimistic about that. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Ross, for the great talk today, and Watch and Yiming for the participation in the Q&A session. Yeah. So with that, I think we'll close the session today, and we hope to see everyone again next time. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye.